Trench warfare in World War I. World War I, often called the Great War, introduced one of the most harrowing and brutal forms of combat in modern history: trench warfare. It was a battle of endurance, with soldiers enduring unimaginable conditions in muddy, rat-infested trenches for months, sometimes years. But what was trench warfare, and how did it define the war? By 1914, Europe was embroiled in a devastating conflict. Nations were mobilizing millions of soldiers, and both sides believed the war would be over by Christmas. But they were wrong. The war dragged on for 4 grueling years, with one key feature defining the Western Front: a network of trenches that stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. The trenches were not simply holes in the ground. They were complex systems designed for defense, often stretching miles in length. There were frontline trenches, support trenches, and reserve trenches, all connected by communication trenches. Each trench was fortified with sandbags, barbed wire, and wooden planks. But even with these defenses, life inside the trenches was anything but safe. The conditions in the trenches were appalling. Soldiers lived in constant fear of artillery bombardments, sniper fire, and poison gas attacks. The trenches were wet, cold, and infested with rats that fed on dead bodies. Disease spread quickly. Trench foot, a painful condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp and unsanitary conditions, was rampant. For many soldiers, life in the trenches became a daily struggle to survive. They would go days without sleep, food was often scarce, and the psychological toll was immense. Shell shock, what we now know as PTSD, affected countless soldiers as they lived through the constant threat of death. Between the trenches lay no man's land, a deadly zone filled with barbed wire, craters from shell explosions, and the bodies of fallen soldiers. Attempts to cross no man's land were often met with devastating machine gun fire or artillery barrages. Many battles during World War I were fought in an effort to gain just a few hundred yards of land, costing thousands of lives in the process. Going over the top was one of the most dangerous maneuvers in trench warfare. Soldiers would be ordered to leave their trenches and charge across no man's land, hoping to break through enemy lines. These attacks were often futile, with waves of soldiers cut down by machine gun fire before they could even reach the other side. Some of the bloodiest battles of the war, such as the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Verdun, were fought in this manner. The Battle of the Somme, fought in 1916, is one of the most infamous examples of the horrors of trench warfare. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties. Despite months of fighting and the loss of over 1 million men on both sides, the front lines barely moved. It was a grim reminder that trench warfare often led to a stalemate, with neither side gaining a significant advantage. As the war progressed, both sides sought new ways to break the deadlock of trench warfare. Poison gas was one of the most feared weapons introduced during World War I. Chlorine and mustard gas could cause agonizing deaths, burning soldiers' lungs and skin. Gas masks became essential equipment, but even with them, the fear of a gas attack loomed large. Tanks, though still in their infancy, were another innovation. Designed to cross no man's land and break through barbed wire, tanks offered hope for a way to overcome the static nature of trench warfare. However, early models were unreliable and often broke down in the thick mud. Despite the horrors, there were moments of humanity in the trenches. Soldiers formed close bonds with their comrades, sharing stories, humor, and letters from home. The famous Christmas truce of 1914 is a remarkable example. For a brief moment, soldiers from both sides left their trenches to exchange gifts, sing carols, and even play football in no man's land. It was a rare moment of peace in an otherwise brutal war. By 1918, the war had taken a massive toll on all involved. The introduction of new tactics and technologies, combined with the exhaustion of both armies, finally led to the end of trench warfare. The signing of the armistice on November 11, 1918, marked the conclusion of one of the deadliest conflicts in history. But the legacy of trench warfare would live on. It changed the way wars were fought and left an indelible mark on the soldiers who survived. For many, the trenches were not just a battleground, but a living nightmare. Trench warfare was a symbol of the brutal and stagnant nature of World War I. It tested the limits of human endurance, leaving deep physical and emotional scars on a generation. And though the guns fell silent in 1918, the memory of those trenches and the men who fought and died in them continues to echo through history.